Hi, well, welcome back. Hirsch Saha here again, and thank you for viewing this video of mine as well, hopefully, and reporting as usual from Auckland, New Zealand. Today is Thursday, the 4th of June, 2026, and geez, still pretty early hours of the morning here, working late again. Yes, that should have also been a title that caught your attention, and you're probably wondering, what does that mean? First, it was communism, now it's IT. Well, this video was, I thought, would be something quite a bit out there and a bit original. I thought it'd be a good one to add to the mix of videos on this channel. And it's actually based on a conversation I had with my father a long time ago. And basically, we came to a bit of a conclusion. First, it was communism. Then it was IT. I know you're still wondering, what the hell do you mean by that, Hirsch? Well, yeah, now it's time for me to explain. Basically, in my father's generation, he was young, sort of in the 60s and 70s, if you like, sort of like a teenager, and then in his 20s in the 1960s and 1970s, he's about 35-ish years older to me, roughly speaking. And so obviously he's from a different generation. He did grow up in India. That's his where he was born and raised, and then he moved to New Zealand in the late 70s, and he's been living in New Zealand pretty much ever since. But he said back in his day, it was communism. And what he means by that, and the conclusion of our argument, is that communism, it was something that was made with the absolute best of intentions. It really was. I mean, today we look back on it and think, geez, how awful that was. What an immense failure that was, and some people even, joke about it, but really coming back to that second point, what an immense failure it was. That's really what I want to get to, because it was really something that was made with the best of intentions. I'll say it again, started by Karl Marx, who was German and Jewish, I think, in the 1800s, the father of Marxism, socialism, communism, and talking about, how a perfect society would be one where everyone was equal, or at least financially equal, and a society where you didn't have classes, rich, middle, poor. And of course, they might sound great at the outset or at the very first instance. It is obviously not the way to do things. It is not fair, and it didn't really work at all like that in the end. You've probably heard the saying, capitalism, which is what we have today, really combined with democracy. That's what we really have in today's society: capitalism and democracy together. We have both public and private sectors. Even communism, people think it's about everyone equal. The true definition of communism is actually a society where everything is publicly owned. So nothing is privately owned. Everything is publicly owned. No one owns anything, but everyone owns everything. All facilities are publicly owned. And on the flip side, capitalism, by definition, because both are really extremes, capitalism by definition is again not really saying rich, middle, poor, as we've come to know it. Capitalism is actually, the definition of it is a society where everything's under private ownership. So under true capitalism, of course, I don't think it's ever really happened, or I'm pretty sure it has never happened in the past, apart from maybe some very primitive societies. But capitalism, true capitalism, would actually be a society where there's even no government. Everything is privately owned. There'll be no taxes either. You're probably thinking, how are laws made? Then I would assume maybe through the courts, but that's a bit of an aside. But really, capitalism by definition would be a society where everything is under private ownership. And I know that sounds horrible. It would be anarchy, wouldn't it? I remember my dad saying that and talked to him about it. It would be anarchy. And of course, both are extremes: capitalism, if you like, right wing, and communism, left wing. And obviously, somewhere in the middle is a so called balance. But that's really what communism and capitalism is by definition. But coming back to communism being something which was made with the absolute best of intentions, no rich oppression, but no poverty either. A society where the poor are not continually exploited and kept in the poverty cycle or the poverty loop by the uber rich, where the top 1%, own the majority of the wealth. Or you've probably heard of the 90-10 rule, where the top 10% of people own 90% of the assets or the wealth, and the remaining 90% of people share the little 10% that's left. And unfortunately, that's pretty much where it's headed in many, of course, each country is different, but that's pretty much more or less where it's actually headed. If you look in a lot of Western countries, as gaps between the rich and poor seem to widen, and it's much easier for the rich to accumulate more and more assets, and it's even difficult for the poor to just come onto the ladder in the first place, if you like, to find their footing. But again, I digress. Coming back to the point, communism was supposed to solve these things. Communism was made with the absolute best of intentions to solve poverty, to solve rich oppression, to bring everyone to an equal level on an equal footing, and thereby create a much better society where we're all financially equal. That's what communism was supposed to do. And I know this might sound like a joke, but what happened in practice? It was not that at all. If anything, people were worse off. Think about the book Animal Farm, written by George Orwell, or even 1984 by the same author. Under communism, people were worse off. What actually happened? We got an evil dictator who slaughtered millions upon millions of people, usually his own people. Think about Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, or Mao Zedong in communist China, Pol Pot in I think that was Cambodia. So unfortunately, that's what happened. And you might have heard the saying, capitalism is where man exploits man. Communism is the opposite, you know. So I remember having this conversation with my dad and saying, in his generation, he's more sort of the Generation X, the millennials. Sorry, Generation X, the baby boomers, and I'm more Generation Y, the millennials. And he was saying, in my generation, it was communism. The big thing at the time that we all knew about, which was basically everywhere, the big thing that was made with the absolute best of intentions, but unfortunately completely fell flat on its face and was a huge failure. At least, think about all the wars it caused and all the, again, the millions of people who were slaughtered under it, and even those who did not die under it, those who suffered under it, and even those who didn't maybe suffer a lot, those who were constantly worried about it. For example, those in the Western world who were continually worried about the Soviet Union taking over, especially those who were in Western Europe, and the Soviet Union was pretty much on their doorstep, Eastern Europe, or the countries immediately south of the Soviet Union, such as India, the Indian subcontinent, and the Middle East, who are not so far away. So communism was the big failure, arguably, of my father's generation, the Generation X, the baby boomers, something which was made with the absolute best of intentions, but was a complete failure. And now coming back to my generation, the millennials, and it's still there today, it was IT. And that's sort of where I'm going with this video, what those two things, communism and IT, have in common. IT was also made with the absolute best of intentions, and if anything, today it's turned into a joke, hasn't it? Maybe a joke at least. It's actually very, very sad because we invested so much of time and effort into it. We basically invested a whole generation into it. IT was supposed to make our offices paperless, right? From what I see, from what I hear, there's more paper in the offices today than was back then. IT was supposed to make our work much simpler. It's not. We've got hard copy, but we've got soft copy, but we've still got hard copy as well. And it seems like we're constantly reconciling between the two. With of course mobile phones. And I know I've mentioned this before. They were the devices that were supposed to free us, and now we're slaves to those very devices. We're constantly on them. IT was supposed to bring the world together so you could work on anything from anywhere at any time. But if anything, we're now working longer hours. We're constantly on call. It's that anxiety about having to keep up with everything, and yes, it was supposed to bring countries together, bring the East and West together, potentially even solve pollution. Because with IT, with the internet, for example, people could work from home. Therefore, they would not have to commute, at least in theory, and therefore they would not have to drive 5 days a week to work and back because they could work from home, and that would solve, pollution at least to a large extent, right? Also traffic and reliance on petrol, petrol prices, petrol reserves, even car crashes, because with less cars on the road or less people driving, there would assumably be, you would assume that there'll be less crashes too. It didn't really do that, didn't it? If anything, we're slaves to our devices. We're more anxious than ever. We're working harder than ever. Work is still very complicated. It was supposed to make our work less, but we're still working long hours, sometimes even longer hours than before. I hate to say this, but it's making our kids fat, stupid, antisocial, always on the devices, and you've heard this before, more connected than ever before, yet more socially distant. And the anxiety that goes with it as well. It's like, oh my God, my page is not getting enough likes, or I've posted this and no one's recognizing it, or I've messaged that person, they haven't responded yet. What's wrong? things like that. And it's like, how come do they not like me? Am I ugly? Am I unlikable? Is there something wrong with me? Is there something, that's off-putting about me? And I can relate to all those things personally, but a lot of people would wonder about that. And sometimes it's just the other person just simply busy, or doesn't have the time, or they've lost their phone, or their phone died, or just it could be any one of those things. Doesn't mean that they actually don't want to talk to you, or they might have just simply missed your message. You really don't know when it's all done remotely. So that's another way to look at it. IT was supposed to free us from so many things, make our work, in summary, make our work simpler, easier, make our work less, bring us together. Give us all a voice. Keep us more connected than ever before. It seems to have done virtually the opposite. It's really caused a lot of harm. And then, of course, there's the very dark side of it, if I haven't mentioned it or touched on it already, such as, cyber crimes and scamming, and you never really know who you're talking to at the other end, and then cyberbullying and things like, deep fakes, and sometimes when people are in relationships and they send nude pictures, one person sends nude pictures of themselves to the other person, and then they break up, and that other person still having the nude pictures threatens to expose it, and obviously that's very worrying. And you've even heard of some young people committing suicide because of that, because their ex-boyfriend or girlfriend is saying, hey, I've got your picture of you naked or whatever, or picture of you doing this, doing that, and I'm going to leak it to the whole world. And some people might find that funny, but I think it's horrendous. I think it's awful. I mean, even me as a grown man, I'd hate to think how I'd react in that sort of situation if someone else had such pictures of me, for example. Yeah, I think anyone in that situation would panic, especially if they're threatening to send it to all your contacts or anything like that. So it's amazing. So for Dad's generation, it was communism, something that was made with the absolute best of intentions, but completely failed. And you can see why. For our generation, it was IT. Again, something made with the absolute best of intentions, but arguably, in many ways, of course, IT has helped in many ways. Don't get me wrong. It's helped in many, many ways, and it's made many things easier, even free. You know, but it has also failed in many ways. I would say, arguably, probably failed in more ways than succeeded. At least that's what I would say based on my research and my knowledge of it. So again, it's a bit of a unique video. This one was, but it makes you think. For Dad's generation, it was communism. For our generation, it's IT. I wonder what will be next. I guess it's any. My mind is already saying AI, but I guess we'll see. That could be a topic for a bit later on, maybe by someone else. But hey, what will be next? I guess we'll see. Thank you.